box, and here is the level crossing barrier, right down, waiting for the train to come. So let's bring her up, shall we? There she is, coming along here beautifully. Coming along the straight, squealing right over the top curve, past the harbour, thundering over the lifting bridge, and into the tunnel. And this time we'll take her into the station. I'll just ease her back a bit. Gently does it. There she goes. Well, if you've one of these railways in the drawing room, then if conversation ever flags, all you've got to do is simply run the train. But not all railways are quite as small as this. In fact, some of them are so large that you've got to run them right outside in the garden. The train you saw running so well on this garden railway is what we call Gauge 1. Now, Gauge 1 is the largest of the model railways. There she is, very large. Now, someone who knows a great deal about models is Don Borum. Don, would you like to tell us about the history of the gauges and their development?
Well, in the beginning of the development, there were 3 gauges, which was 1, 2, and 3. And 1 gauge was not the largest, but the smallest of those gauges.
The poor man's?
The poor man's railway, in fact. Although it must be admitted that you need an awful lot of equipment and skill to be able to deal with Gauge 1.
I know.
Now, as gauges got smaller, the next one down was O gauge. The scale of which is 7 millimetres to the foot, and the gauge is 32 millimetres. Now, this is a very useful gauge because it can be run equally well in steam or electricity or indoors or outdoors. And up to about 1923, there was nothing smaller.
What happens next?
What happens next was that the double O gauge was introduced this size.
Hold on for a second. I'll put a matchbox in to give you a relative size.
Excellent idea. The scale of that is 4 millimetres to the foot, and the gauge is 16.5 millimetres. It's known as double O. Now, the next one below that is HO. HO is 3.5 millimetres to the foot, and it's the same gauge, 16.5 millimetres, as double O, and it's a much more accurate scale gauge representation. Unfortunately, this gauge is not used in this country, but extensively on the continent in America.
And the next one down?
The next one down is known as TT, and TT stands for tabletop. The scale is 3 millimetres to the foot, the gauge is 12 millimetres. Nowadays, it's more or less obtainable in kits of parts only, so you have to make your own models.
All right, let's go one down.
Now, one below that is N gauge. N stands for 9, and it refers to the fact that the track gauge is 9 millimetres. The scale is about 2 millimetres to the foot.
That's the one we had on the coffee table.
Yes, and it's a very nice line, as you can see.
And the next one down is so small that you really need a watchmaker's eyeglass to have a look at it.
And I have no intention whatever of touching this one. This is Z gauge, the last word, you see. The scale is about 1.5 millimetres to the foot, and the track gauge is 6.5 millimetres. And believe it or not, it's been done in steam.
They'll do anything in steam.
Indeed they will.
Now, Don, what is your own personal great love?
Well, my own personal preference is for narrow gauge. And here is a model of a locomotive which ran on the Pentuan Railway in Cornwall in the 1880s. I put it next to the O gauge locomotive because these two are of the same scale.
It's unbelievable.
It isn't really. And a little man standing on the footplate there would be perfectly compatible with a little man standing on the footplate there because they're the same scale.
But the track's very different, isn't it?
The track gauge is not the same, of course, because this is a narrow gauge locomotive. The track gauge of this 16.5 millimetres is the same as that. And there the resemblance ends, because the sleeper spacing and sizes are compatible with these here.
What else comes out of your stable, Don?
Well, there's one oddity in that the Listowel and Ballybunion Railway in Ireland was a monorail, and my friends always refer to this as the no gauge. You see, it runs on one single rail, which is even narrower, of course, than Z gauge, the other two being merely for purposes of stabilisation.
You've got to be fairly nutty to make one of those.
Oh, you have, but fortunately I am, so that's all right.
Now, Don, seriously, what sort of advice would you give a beginner?
Well, first of all, of course, join a club. Because in a club you can get all the help, assistance, advice that you need. Apart from that, I suggest that the beginner should try their hand at 4mm scale modelling 00, because completed models are available, also parts. Very easy.
And what happens if he hasn't got enough space for
Well,
that?
in that case, I suggest he tries N gauge, because, again, completed models and also a certain amount of parts are available, and, of course, it is the scenic maker's paradise.
Well, model railways don't just consist of locomotives. So let's take a look at a couple of working layouts. Let's start with one that's been run at a club meeting. This layout is approximately 20 foot long and 2 foot wide and is in 00 gauge. It represents a sleepy West Country branch line and was built by members of the Twickenham Model Railway Club. The interesting thing about this layout is that it gives you the real atmosphere of a West Country branch line. Even the coal wagons have the right feel about them. And there's a nice touch with a shepherd tending his flock of sheep. And the barn with the figures and the horse help to complete the rural scene. There's even a fallen tree lying in a pond. And here comes the goods train, just about to cross the river. The loco on the passenger train is uncoupled and will eventually go to the shed for servicing. And here is a fresh loco for the return journey. Not everyone is satisfied with only running on a club layout. Many modelers also like to have a layout in their own home. And where better to have one than in the garage? After all, isn't this what garages are for? This is an HO Continental layout built by John Christie, and it includes overhead traction wires. Even the pantograph looks realistic. And you can tell it's a Continental layout from the signs on the goods train. Here's some more clues. Not many people realize that if you build a full-scale model of Waterloo Station in 00 gauge, you need, believe it or not, the size of one tennis court. And that's why many people build their models in a smaller gauge. Now, this particular model is built in N gauge by Bert White and his friends of Bristol East Model Railway Club. Now, Bert, why did you particularly choose N gauge?
Well, first thing, Bob, we were limited by the size of room we had available. We had intended building a 00 layout, but N gauge proved the satisfactory answer to our problem.
So you settled for that?
Yes, we did.
Well, let's go and have a look down the line. Let's start with the quarry up there. It's a proper quarry with a railway siding to it. You've got an elevator leading right down onto the working face, and at the bottom you've got a small miniature railway with bad track as the prototype. Let's walk down the railway. What have we got there? Ooh, it looks wet and dirty.
Well, that is a pool which we produced by clear casting resin, coloured at various stages.
It looks really dirty and it's almost smelly. What have you got in there?
Well, that's an old railway wagon that was pushed off by vandals.
Oh, what a horrid habit. Well, talking about water, let's have a look at your stream. It looks beautifully clean and fresh. Done the same way, is it?
Yes, that's done the same way, colouring at various levels.
And having a stream there with obviously fish in it and everything else, have you got a mill?
Yes, the mill no longer working, I'm afraid now. Old Mr. Hobbs passed away a few days ago.
I see you have some sheep in the pen in your goods yard. They've been recently sold, have they?
Yes, Quibble and Cuss, the auctioneers, sold them to the local abattoir.
And they're still shipping them by train?
To the local town.
Oh, that's rather nice. And let's walk down then from the goods yard across the level crossing into the forecourt of the station. It's a nice wide open station, and at right angle to the station you've got 3 houses. They're rather nice houses. Who lives there?
Railwaymen. You can tell that by the well-tended back gardens.
Oh yes, they do look nice, and they have the washing out. They don't mind the smuts, do they?
No, not at all.
Oh, that's very nice indeed. Now, along the railway line next to the station, you've got Hobbs. It says Hobbs Flour and Hobbs Transport. Why is that?
Well, it has now been taken over by the son of Hobbs, the miller, as a transport business.
He's got a good position for that there. And right behind Hobbs is, of course, is the church. Nice 4-square tower, beautifully tended graveyard, and I see the gravedigger is digging away there. You've had a recent bereavement.
Yes, Mr. Hobbs, the miller.
Oh, that's sad, but I presume his son is carrying on the business.
Yes, he is indeed.
Well, what other industry have you got in the village?
We have a timber yard just up the line.
Oh, yes, and the railway siding naturally leading to it, which is how it ought to be. And the front of the building has the name and the telephone number for the railway passengers to see as they go by. And what's happening further up the line?
Further up, we have the remains of a hill fort, and just further on again, we have 5 Druid stones.
Ah, and the railway itself disappears in a tunnel underneath the hill. Well, I think it's about time to run a train. I say, Bert, that was an absolutely lovely run. Really perfect. Tell me, how did you base all these buildings? What did you base them on?
Well, Bob, my son went out with his camera round and about Bristol and photographed lots of cottages and other buildings. And we very loosely based our models on these.
But did you build correct copies of them?
Not precise copies, no. In fact, we incorporated 1 or 2 photographs into one building.
And when we talked about this place, it seemed to have real live people in it.
Yes, over the course of building, we have in fact built up a real living community.
Now, if you're planning to build a model railway, then I personally think it's probably better to base at least part of it on some existing line or station. Now, in our next program, we're going to show you how to build a model railway from scratch. So let's end this one by showing you how we did our preliminary research. Now, for this particular exercise, we picked Horsted Keynes Station on the Bluebell Railway in Sussex. Well, here we are, ready for the occasion, dressed for the fray, permission to work here, fitted out with map, paper, and of course the camera, which is, and believe it or not, that is the camera, and naturally we tape measure to measure the distances and heights and everything else we can do. So let's get going and see what it looks like. This is the old main line connecting East Grinstead here in front of us to Haywards Heath right behind us. And this line, of course, has been lifted some time ago, but for the sake of our model railway, we want to set it up again and run it. And here, going right to down here, down to Lewes, is the branch line. And the branch line, of course, is the line which is now being operated by the Bluebell Society as a working railway. Now, the reason why we want to model this layout here is because it's a typical junction between a branch line, a nice little wandering country branch line, and a main line. And also it has what I would call a very nice railway station. So let's go and have a look at it. Well, there it is, a pretty little station built at the turn of the century, exactly the sort of mid-Victorian architecture and country charm that we would like to model. And it is the sort of station which has both. It has the rural atmosphere that you want for a rural junction, a sleepy rural junction. It's got the main line. It's got the other advantage. It's got 4 platforms, 1, 2, 3, 4, and it's got underpasses at the back there, which give you the benefit of all the modeling tricks you'd like to incorporate it. But before you do anything else, the first thing we've got to do is to sit down or make a note of all the track diagram. Now, the way to do it is either you walk along and make a close note of all the points, all the turnouts, all the little stub sidings, or if you're lucky, you can get into the signal box and get a layout of the track diagram there. Now, if you want to model a signal box, and this sort of signal box like this is very, very important, the ideal way to go about it is to have a proper engineering drawing of it. But that isn't always possible. And so the answer is to take a photograph. But it's very important to remember that the sort of photograph you're going to take is not the type of photograph you might like for your collection in the album. Down here, a sort of shot like this. Well, that's very pretty, but it certainly won't give you the records you want. What you really want is to take the photograph square on, absolutely square. You look at it like this. The bricks, in fact, the bricks themselves are virtually your scale, so you can read the size of the box off from the bricks. So camera straight, nice and straight, eye level straight, and adjust it. So here you are with a photograph of the sketch, some of the finer details of the canopies and canopy supports which make the station. And it pays to make a careful note of the vital measurements. Now, that is a very typical water tower setup, the sort of setup you get in all branch line stations and all junctions. Here you've got an engine house, you've got a water tower or the water tower plinth. The water tower has been taken off, of course. There must have been a metal water tower on top, which we'll have to rebuild. But basically, it's so typical of a junction where locomotives take water that unless we build this type of thing, you're missing half the atmosphere, and this is very, very important. Of course, you can do all sorts of funny things like measuring up these lovely old York stones. Now, they make a good... They're not always the same, so you might as well look how wide they are. This is 3'11". It's not 4 foot. And that's worth remembering and noting. And, of course, finally, let's have a look at this sort of thing, this very beautiful cast iron Victoriana. That can be repeated quite easily. All you've got to do, an upright, a bit of fuse wire, soldered up and painted, and that gives it the style and the character you need to make this a real model, not a toy. There are no prizes for guessing that this isn't a model railway, but it is the sort of scene and atmosphere that railway modelers try to recreate in miniature. But before you rush off to build your model railway, you ought to plan it, and plan it carefully. Now, this is an example what a plan like this looks like. Here you are, track diagram. It shows you your turnouts, it shows you your platform, it shows you the structures here, station building, engine shed, everything. It gives you a chance to look at the capabilities of your layout itself. And if you are even more ambitious, you can build a model of the model itself, like this one here. This is very large, it belongs to a club, and it shows very clearly what you can do. Now let's take this little baseboard here. Here you see the two levels of the track very clearly. You see the contours of the countryside, and if you turn it over, you can even see the construction of the baseboard itself. And this is the moment when you can make your mistakes and rectify them. But there are two ways of building a baseboard. One is to put a solid top like this one on here. We covered this area completely just to show you. And we used a material which is not really ideal. It's called hardboard. Look, it's springy and at the same time noisy. Not an ideal material. So if you want to cover your baseboard completely, solidly, use this sort of material. This is insulation board. It's not so flexible and it's not so noisy. It's much better. And there's another way of doing it, using an open structure like this. You pin your bearers for the track bed down like that, and track bed on top here. And when the track goes on finally, it would look something like that. The advantages are that you've got nice embankment here. You could put your rivers neatly under there without actually cutting away the board, or your road underpasses. And your scenery could then come up here very easily. It's totally accessible all the time, and we call it an open-top baseboard. Now, in our last program, we showed you how we went down to the Bluebell line to record Horsted Keynes Station. Now, these are some of the photographs we took, and these are some of the sketches we made. Having done our research and having planned the layout, the next job is obviously to get down and build it. So we've asked the practicing model maker to show us how it's done. Jack Kine, where do we start?
Well, the scenery came first, Bob, and that's where we've started. We've had to lay part of the track in this case because of time. But as you can see, I've already got part of this hillock that's very, very prominent at Horsted Keynes already up, and I've left this piece open. I've been working on it. Now, this is a method of construction which is slightly peculiar to me in that it is made from cardboard strips, which are the contour shapes. They are latticed together with other pieces of card to form this geodetic structure, which, although it's fairly springy, is able to support the top coating. For the top coating, I use a material which can be purchased from a dress shop for stiffening underskirts and so on, and that is cut into a number of squares, about 4 by 3 inches, and that will be applied to this particular card structure. To stick the material to the card, I use a plastic compound which comes in dry powder form and mixed with hot water produces a rather delicious goo like that, about that consistency. Now, to put the stuff on, you start to lay it up, not too thickly, but attaching it wherever the material sticks to the card. Allow an overlap and work your way along in that fashion.
It's rather like putting a bandage on it as a plaster of Paris bandage.
Very similar, Bob, very similar. It's also not unlike laying up glass fibre when you're building boats and car bodies, only in a miniature form. Now this we continue right the way up like this. If we had been cooking, Bob, I should have said I've got one in the oven and I'll get it out in a moment. But I'm hoping I can get this on so that everyone can see exactly what I'm doing.
I see you putting one layer on rather than...
I'm only putting one layer on at this stage, and in a minute when I've reached the top, which is up here, I shall come back downstairs and start with another layer. A bit more of this stuff.
Mm-hmm. Now, Jack, how do you get a sort of texture into that?
Well, this will come, Bob, when we get the second coat over the top of this. And already you'll see what I'm getting at. Any holes you fill up. Laid across at different angles. It doesn't matter if it doesn't follow through exactly square. But you must be sure that you get it all firmly attached to the structure underneath. And you'll discover, as you work your way through this stuff, that the material that I'm using softens up under the action of the plaster or paint or goo and the material itself, and it becomes practically self-adhesive. In fact, it's really quite sticky right now.
Now, when you want to shape it?
Now we want to shape it, we can start then to apply the stuff in a much thicker form. And this, I will use a spatula, and you can apply it like that. And within about an hour or more, that will be dry. I think, if you don't mind, Bob, I'll carry on to the top part here.
Now, when you want to plant, for instance, bushes into that, Jack,
well,
how would you go about that?
This is a very versatile gunk, this stuff. And if you want to plant a bush, take your bush and plant it.
Just like that?
With the roots.
That's firm.
That's firm, or will be when it's dry.
Now, we really are sort of at a white stage of this fellow here. How would you eventually bring it to life?
Well, the next stage in the game, Bob, I'll let that dry now, is to move on to the painting stage. And for that, you will need some emulsion paint, some good brushes, a palette, and some watercolour paints. These are artist watercolours. And I'm already, having laid this particular part out, decided where the grass is going to go, where this particular scree has come. You see how it can be modelled up. Mm-hmm. And by applying your paint to that particular scree, it goes into the texture, and immediately you'll see what will happen. I'll pick an earth line, which I know is a bit lower down, around about there. And I'll work. Now, can you see the way the colour begins to run into that?
It comes to life.
And all that texture is picked up immediately by that.
What's that?
That's I'm just getting the colours darker. I'm using umber and black at this stage because I'm trying to get this scree to come really high. You needn't be frightened of using plenty of water on this. It doesn't do any harm at all. Can you see the way that texture picks up with the colour run on it? Get it dug into some of those deeper places. This is virtually three-dimensional painting.
Well, let's leave Jack Kine with painting and talk a little about track laying. Because model railway layouts which have badly laid track don't run well and are very disappointing. Well, someone who has laid virtually all gauges of track is Fleetwood Shaw. Fleet, what advice for beginners, please?
Well, the beginners have virtually got two choices from the point of view of track. They have prefabricated lengths of curves to standard radius and straights, and they have flexible track, which can be flexed to any configuration that's required.
Right, well, if, for instance, the beginner has bought some of this track, is he stuck with this curve?
No, he isn't. This can be modified so that it can be curved to any radius, simply by cutting through one of the every fourth or so web between the sleepers with a fine saw, such I'm doing now. I've done the rest of them already. Mm-hmm. And then it can be, in fact, flexed either to a sharper radius or to a less sharp radius, just as required.
Well, now, what about joining track? Are there snags?
Yes, well, joints are snags. They're the Achilles heel of the railway track system. These have, in fact, fish plates provided, but they don't necessarily provide an immaculately good joint always, and they sometimes require certain attention with a small pair of pliers. And if there's any suggestion of a bump, this again can be rectified using a small Swiss file, a few strokes, and the feel of the finger is the best test as to whether it's right or not.
Well, now we've got a track joined, and that's a curve directly joined to a straight. That isn't a good idea.
Well, you know very well that it isn't, Bob.
And it is well.
The way to get over this, really, simply, is never to allow a joint to occur at the junction between a curve and a straight. And if you arrange for a long length of flexible track such as this, I'm laying it together so that you can see the effect, you automatically get a nice, sweet transition between the straight and the curve.
Yes, there's a remarkable difference, really. If you look at it here, this goes straight and then sharply into the curve, and here you've got a very gentle, very sweet curve starting.
Well worth doing.
Must be a much sweeter
Well worth
running.
doing, yes.
Well, that's much about straight track. Now, what about points, or I think, as you would call it, turnouts?
Yes, I would call them turnouts. Well, the main thing to say about these is simply that you use the longest radius, in other words, the longest turnout, longest lead, that you have the space for. And, in fact, on running lines, use the longest ones. These shorter ones are all right for sidings.
So, these turnouts for the main line, and if you've got those, use them only in sidings.
Preferably.
Right. What about track laying itself?
Well, the simplest method of track laying is simply to pin the track, whether it's prefab or flexible, loosely pin it onto the roadbed, which we can do now. But the secret is not to pin it down too hard, not to use a hard glue and glue it down. It'll allow some resilience, some movement.
Well, this looks a bit stark. I wouldn't be very satisfied with that.
No, well, there are ways and means of producing a better looking job. This particular length has been ballasted with carpet tape, which is in fact an adhesive backed tape for sticking carpets together or down. And,
available in any carpet shop?
Available in any carpet shop. And it's been the track has been placed on it, and the ballast in fact is granular cork, which has been spread over and then loosely dusted off. This end's been painted to show the considerable improvement by applying a little paint.
It looks much better, but say I'm a real purist and I want a Rolls Royce of tracks, what then?
Well, to build more resilience in, which is highly desirable really, lay it on sorbet rubber, again using a rubber adhesive, and this really gives you resilience.
Yes, you can see the track is sprung.
The same spot 2.5 hours later. Well, I think it's quite remarkable what Jack's been able to achieve. Just look at it. That cliff, that little promontory, and you can see where the water that's come down has cut a little runnel in the cliff face, and it's gone down and taken some of the cliff with it, and a little shrub growing at the bottom. And here you can see the water sort of eroded a little bit of the soil out of the cliff face, and it's streaked down there, dirtying it. And further down, the chalk, the little strip of chalk has come down and crumbled and screed down to the base, and the fresh grass is growing on it, and shrubs everywhere, spring grass and light green, and the railway. It's quite amazing. I think it's most impressive and really exciting.
Well, Jack, what next?
Well, Bob, you said bushes, so now let's put in some trees. And I'll produce some trees for you. Now, the prescription for trees is a piece of soft wire, about 1 foot long, some hairy string from your friendly newsagent.
What, just ordinary string?
Just ordinary hairy string. It's got to be the hairy variety, which you cut into 2 or 3 inch lengths. So
Yes.
these will then be unwound and broken up into their original strands.
But just teased out?
Just teased out so that you get little packs of what will be the branches of the tree.
Mm-hmm.
About 3 of these, I think 2 or 3 of these will do. Now, exercises where I'm hoping you're going to give me a hand. The next thing you do is you take your piece of wire, you bend it, and you place it in a drill chuck, so, which goes on a nail. And Bob, if you can feed that little hairy bed of hamster's nest in there.
I'll just like this, through the thing,
right.
and
Spread them so they're fairly evenly dispersed.
yes, like this.
Pretty good. And I'll take over from there.
Right.
Now, you wind away until the wire breaks, which it's done. We'll cut a piece off like that. Now, I think I ought to get rid of that bit in the middle there. Now, by pushing this around a bit, you've got the semblance of a rather untidy looking, but nevertheless easily recognised tree.
Yes.
So now, before it gets its leaves, it needs a haircut. And get rid of some of the longer twigs that hang out. Shape it generally.
This is the moment where you can turn it into an apple tree if you want.
Yes, you can turn it into an apple tree. Now, we've got to get the leaves to stick to the string.
Yes.
So I use polyurethane varnish for this. Now, you can use shellac, but I personally prefer it. And the object of the manoeuvre is to get all that string saturated, so in it goes.
You just dunk it?
Dunk the lot.
Yes.
And with a piece of stick, make sure that every particle of string is covered. Now we're at the messy stage. Because if you can imagine doing this in the kitchen, you get it everywhere.
Yeah, that looks horrid.
Now let it drain a reasonable time, so you get rid of the surplus varnish. Now I've still got to get a lot of that varnish off. And Bob, I have by the side of you down there a bucket. If you'd be a friend and bring it up.
There we are. One bucket.
I pops it in. Now I'm spinning the tree now to spin off the surplus varnish.
Yes.
Now comes the moment of truth. This is when the leaves go on.
What are you putting on? What is that?
Coloured sawdust, Bob. No more, no less.
Just coloured
Just
sawdust?
coloured sawdust.
But it's got different colours.
There are 3 colours mixed together here. I like to use a little brown and a darker green in it. And there is your tree.
That's really remarkable. That's beautiful.
Want me to plant it?
Yes, please. But I think that is quite remarkable. It looks perfect. Jack, what else can you do?
Well, now, if you take the same basic shape, tree, and you tease one up and one down, you get 3 for the price of one. One little fir tree, one little poplar tree.
That's very
Treated
good.
in the same way. Well, on Sunday, my younger daughter helped me make some trees. She'd never made any before. I suppose, Bob, I better not waste any more time. I'll go tree planting.
That's it. Well, the scenery is virtually completed, Jack. What about the buildings now?
Well, we took the photographs and drawings, and from those, I started work now on the main station.
It looks fabulous. It looks terribly complicated.
No, it isn't, Bob. It is only a series of boxes. That's all it is. One alongside the other. Nicely, carefully cut. Everything nice and square. Time taken is well worth it. They look complex. The window frames and the door frames and things may look a bit complex, but in fact they're not.
What's the material you're using for this?
This is a plastic card, fairly thick for certain areas and thin on others. But I mean, you can get the feel of the stuff quite easily to get the thickness of the lintels right, etc.
It looks really wonderful. What does it look like when you've painted it on the other side?
I've painted the other side, as you can see. And I think to show it, I'll put it down in position. Make sure that I don't overhang the platform, that's right.
It really looks superb. It really does look good. That roof is weathered, it's got lichen on it.
That's here, yes.
I see you've even got the pointing on the chimney there. How do you get this extraordinary effect on the brickwork?
Well, Bob, the card is embossed and it is painted with oil paint.
Oh, this is the material
This
it's
is the
made
material
of.
it is made from. It's an embossed card. The brickwork's already embossed, but you can't see it because the pointing is too dark.
Yes.
And we use our old friend, the plastic material that has been used for the layout, and with a little judicial rubbing, it fills all those little cracks up, and immediately the mortar shows up.
Ah, there you are. You can see the pointing.
Yep. And it has also taken the colour down a mite, which is a good thing to do.
Yes, well, this is quite remarkable. But now look at the canopy, for instance. That's aged and weathered, and it's got a sort of wet look about it.
Well,
Isn't it?
that's achieved again by thinning out the paint, and the final wet look is achieved by, well, I hope the wife doesn't mind, I pinched some of the hairspray.
Well done.
The main station building, the long one. Again, I've only started work on this. I haven't finished the roof or the underside, but that pops in there.
That looks very smart.
I think we ought to put a signal boxing. Now this, as opposed to these two, which were scratch built, was made from one of the paper kits.
Ah, yes. It's a paper kit.
Yes, and it's remarkably like the Horsted Keynes signal box, which is rather nice. I've changed the windows a little, that's all. And Bob, perhaps we
Shall I
could
put it
pop
in
that
for
in.
you?
Thank you.
Right. There we go. I think that's where she went. Nice and square.
Lovely.
That's it. There she is.
And I think, finally, Bob, a little hut, which should go in somewhere.
The bothy. Without a bothy, no railway is complete.
Is
There
that
she
so?
goes. Nice and square again. And home and dry. Well, Jack, we've got so far. But what else have we got to do?
A lot of work yet, Bob. The station roof to be completed, chimneys to go on, steps into the subway, handrail round it, people, bicycles, a load more work. But one thing we do need, and I think we can get it now, and that is something every layout needs, and that is a backcloth, a sky. So if you like, I'll call one up. Okay, boys, lower it in.
Well, there it is. A 00 gauge model of Horsted Keynes Station on the Bluebell line. In the next program, we shall complete the layout with the wiring and the signals. But let's end this one by mixing from our model to the real Horsted Keynes Station. That, in case you didn't recognize it, was Horsted Keynes Station on the Bluebell line in Sussex. And this is a 00 gauge model of Horsted Keynes Station made for us in the last program by Jack Kine. Now, it has since been wired up and signaled by Stuart Hine. Stuart, how do you go about wiring up a layout?
If you only want to operate one locomotive at a time, all you need to do is to join two wires to the two rails anywhere on the layout, and your rail joiners do the rest. I've already drilled 2 little holes in the baseboard, close to the rail. I've pushed a wire up through one of them and tinned the spot on the rail base to accept it. Now all I have to do is to apply a little bit of cord solder and soldering iron, and just hold it in place for a few seconds till the solder sets.
Any snags or difficulties here?
Well, of course, the dreaded dry joint.
How do you avoid it?
By making sure your iron is hot enough so that you heat the job up properly, and by not pulling on the wire to see if the solder has set yet.
Well, that much for a plain straight line. Now, let's talk about points, or to give them a proper name, turnouts. How do you operate them?
The ones we used have a little over-center spring, which leaves them in the position in which you set them. So provided you can reach them from the control position, you can just set them by hand, and the blades do the electrical switching as well.
But I see here you have an electrical switch operating a turnout. Why is that?
Because it's easier to get hold of, it gives you a wider choice of contact arrangements, and it's much more reliable.
Well, that's one way of doing it. What other methods have you got?
Where the turnouts are fairly near the control position, I like to use the wire-in-tube method.
Ah, that is a very fine wire operating in a copper or plastic tube. And that wire operates the actual switch blades.
That's right. I like to use these radio rotary switches and modify the mechanism to push and pull the wire.
Yes.
You have a nice choice of contact arrangements on the back, and the knob forms part of the track diagram.
And talking about track diagrams, let's have a look at ours. And here are the tracks of our model of Horsted Keene station neatly drawn out on the track diagram with a variety of electrical controls superimposed on them. This, for instance, is a point switch operating an electric point. Let's see it work. And next to it, we've got a switch isolating a little track dead end here, like this. If you switch it off, you can leave a loco standing on it without energizing it. Next to it, we've got a switch that provides power to the south or the north end of the layout, and this switch operates a signal. Let's see it work. There we are. Stuart, what makes a signal work?
Well, this one's got a little miniature relay mounted underneath, with a piece of fine wire running up through the post to operate the arm. You move the switch, you'll see it move.
That's extremely neat and simple. Have you got much more to do?
Only the signals at the other end, I've just got to connect them up. And I'm going to do that now.
While Stuart's finishing off the wiring, let's have a look at some locomotives and rolling stock. Now, in the more popular gauges, you can virtually buy your train off the shelf. But if you're a bit more ambitious, you may want to build your own vehicles from kits. Now, someone who's built kits and modified kits for many years is Robert Ormiston-Chant. Now, Robert, what sort of kits are available?
You can have kits which are printed on card, or you can have them of plugged-together parts which are ready-made for you. Or you can assemble them from injection molded plastic parts, or you can assemble them from cast metal parts, and finally you can assemble them from hard metal parts which are stamped and formed for you.
Well, Robert, let's start straight away with a plastic kit just as it comes out of the box.
Yes.
How do you put it together?
Well, the first thing you must do is cut it from the runners which give rise to each individual part. And for this you use a curved knife and a block of wood as a support to avoid damaging any of the frail parts of the kit.
Now what next?
And then after this is the end of the band that I'm cutting now.
Yes.
You then cement them together with a plastic solvent.
How long does that take to dry, incidentally?
About 10 seconds for you to handle it. And you use a small block of wood to make sure that you've got the two parts square together.
That's very simple and neat. Now, when the vehicle's finished, in its unpainted form, it looks like this. It's quite smart, it's got lots of detail on it, but obviously you've got to paint it and turn it into your own. And this is, of course, a good example of what a vehicle looks like when you make it your own. This one is built out of two separate kits, two separate van bodies, its own underframe under here, and its own running gear, if you care to look, and naturally its own lettering. So you can virtually turn kits into your own vehicles if you want to. And finally, of course, you can turn them into locomotives. That's a locomotive made from a plastic kit. But you've got some metal over there. Robbo, what's this?
This is a grain wagon, and made of cast metal parts, which are fitted together by filing them until they exactly fit.
It's a sort of precision fitting.
You have to take much more care than with the ordinary model, the ordinary plastic model.
And how can you join them?
You can join them with epoxy resin, cement, or with an impact adhesive, or you can use the special low temperature solders.
Which do you prefer?
I prefer to use the solders because they give a neater joint and a much stronger one.
Difficult?
No, they're quite easy to do, but you must be careful not to melt the soft metal of the parent kit.
So all you've got to do really is to run the solder in here now?
Yes, it will flow into the joint quite easily, and you'll see how neat the joint is.
It goes together very, very simply. And very quickly. Now let's have a look at some completed vehicles. There they are. That's a 20-ton coal vehicle. Then there's a bit of coaching stock here. And, of course, a locomotive. And this one looks extremely smart. It's a kit, but it's very nicely put together, and it really is a nice loco to have. But let's have a look at these bits here. What are they?
But these are stamped out of nickel silver and turned from brass, and some of them are pressed up into shape.
And that gives you, finally, when you've completed it,
It gives you a tank locomotive looking like this. It's assembled with ordinary Tinman solder, and you have to make and fit quite an amount of detail yourself, such as this sandbox, or this toolbox, there's the injector, and the handrails.
Of course, the next stage is building entirely from scratch. Just take a look at these models. You see a pair of private owner vehicles. The left one has been in service some time, it's a bit dirty, and the right one's brand spanking new, straight out of paint shops, looking absolutely resplendent. And then this very fine Great Western auto coach, beautiful with every detail. Even the windows are down. Well, it's always summer in the Great Western country. And then, of course, to crown it all, a king. And that is magnificent. If you think it's all in 00 gauge, very, very small, just look at the front end. It's got everything on it, all the details. I am really envious of that one. At this point, let's go back to our Horster-Keynes model and run some trains. Over to you, Stuart.
Well, it looks like summer in Brighton Line country as well today. Here we've got an up semi-fast Brighton to Victoria train, which is just waiting to pick up a few passengers off a stopper from East Grinstead to Lewes, which is just coming in under the bridge now.
Oh, yes, she's coming down nicely, Stuart. I see she's got a milk van on. What's she going to do with that?
She's going to drop that one off here.
Oh, yes, she's making a connection now.
Yes. Just a couple of minutes wait for the passengers to get through the subway. Watch the starting signal.
Ah, there she
There it
goes.
goes, and she's away.
Beautiful, lovely day, and she's all the way up to London. What happens next, Stuart?
The milk van's been uncoupled, and she's just drawing forward into the siding. Throw the turnouts. Back her up to the loading dock.
And now?
Uncouple. Draw forward again.
You're going back onto
Throw
the
the
train.
turnouts once more. Put her back on the train.
Are you ready to couple up now?
Yes.
What happens now?
Well, any moment now, we'll resume our rather leisurely way down the Bluebell line towards Lewes. There goes the starter signal. We're off.
Down our branch line now.
Yes.
Now let's stay at Horsted Keynes for just one more train movement, Stuart. What's next?
I think there's another Brighton train due any moment. Yes, here she comes now.
Our Horsted Keynes layout is obviously an indoors layout, but there are many models who run their railways outdoors, in the garden. And the most popular way of propelling them is by steam. It's Peter Howland raising steam on his Duchess. And he's filling up water into the tender. Distilled water is usually the best thing. Just pumping a little into the boiler, making sure the bypass is open. That's right, just a little water in the boiler is always a good thing. And now charcoal. Charcoal soaked in meths makes a very good base for a fire. Starts it very easily. A nice wide box, it shouldn't be difficult. And now the blower. That creates artificial draft. Snatch in and it's away. It doesn't take long. There's enough steam to go on our own blower now. And now coal, anthracite grains actually, just to cover the fire. Yes, the gauge is rising a bit. Ah, it looks much better. Now proper coal on it. She's ready to back onto the carriages. Isn't it a lovely garden? The right setting for a railway. It couldn't be more beautiful. No garden's complete without one of these. To the Waterloo Station. And that's the rest of us trying to steam up. But there's an older way of propulsion. It's clockwork. That's hand wound. It's the oldest way, and it's beautiful. Another form of propulsion, a Southern electric train. Actually picks up its juice from the third rail. Easily controllable and very amenable. There she comes and stops beautifully in the station. Latest form of propulsion, accumulator electric locos with their accumulators in the loco themselves, electronically controlled, powerful, very amenable and easy to drive. And that's the diesel electric. I claim authorship to this one. It's a Type 4. I'm just setting the controls, making sure compression's right. And now on with the body. Quite easy to fit it on. Just 4 screws. Start the battery on, set it for the right position. Starting, check the throttle, press the button, and off she goes. Scratch building your own loco or rolling stock is obviously not for the raw beginner, but neither is it as frightening as many people may think. All you need is access to some machine tools. Look at this. Small lathe, perfectly competent little lathe, little pillar drill like that, brazing torch and a hearth, tool chest, and even then it's not necessary to have any of this to build a little loco like that. You can always go to one of the many evening classes held specially for model engineers. This might look like a machine shop in a factory, but in fact it's an evening class at the St. Albans College of Further Education. Here's a chap setting up a lathe. He's just facing off a piece of metal. And that's a loco wheel. And this character's machining on the tread. That's fly cutting on a milling machine. It's getting a clean surface on the cylinder block or something that needs to be absolutely flat. And not to forget the most important art of all, filing. Measuring up the footplate of a locomotive. A very busy scene here. Everybody's doing something. A little marine engine, which is obviously being tested out. Just seeing how free it is. Plugs going in the back head of a boiler, ready for water testing. And now the front end going onto a loco. And once the loco is completed, it needs to be tried out. This is a live steam meeting of the North London Society of Model Engineers. You can just see the water going in the tender. Pumping up here is a much bigger job. And even shoveling in coal just shows. So nice head of steam and enough water. And this is a 3.5-inch gauge loco being moved over the track. And they're using a very ingenious way of railing it. You can see it's a dual-purpose track. The outer track is for 5-inch gauge, the inner for 3.5. And here comes the 5-inch gauge loco. Using the same re-railer. See how much bigger she is. Once on the track, she now backs up to her driving truck. And it's such a very, very large gauge that you've got to ride on the truck, straddling it, to be able to drive your locomotive.
think.
There they are, ready to take a train of passengers. 3 passengers off to Clisterborough. Pulling hard now. It's a lovely point of view. Sitting behind your own loco and really driving it. I think that moment you really made it.